This is Your Bird Story, a broadcast of bird stories told by everyday people about their interactions and relationships with wild birds in cities. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Hi, everyone. Today I'm sharing Zoom space with Emily Williams, and I'm going to ask Emily to introduce herself to you all.
Thanks, Georgia. Happy to be here. I'm Emily Williams, and I'm a current PhD student at Georgetown University studying the migration of American robins.
Emily, before we sort of really started this portion of the conversation, we were talking about your day in the field, and I would love for you to describe for folks your field season.
Yeah, so I have been going in the field pretty much every day that there's good weather since essentially, robins have set up territories starting in the spring. So I've started this work in early April, and I will likely go until maybe the first week or two in August. And during that time, a typical day, robins start singing when it's still dark outside. Compared to a lot of other songbirds, you talk to most ornithologists and you ask about their field day, and they're like, oh yeah, we set up nets half hour before sunrise. And I start quite a bit earlier than that. So today, for example, I woke up at 3 and I try to get to my sites by 4 a.m. to try to get nets open when it's still dark outside. And the reason for that is because robins are awake and active at that time, and they're super smart. So if they see the nets, they avoid them. So the goal is to try to get the nets open and catch them. Basically, in the first hour to 2 hours in the morning, they're really focused on singing and they're not really flying around too much. But like 45 minutes before sunrise, females usually pop off the nests if they're incubating or brooding young and go forage first thing in the morning. So we try to get the females if they're on nests, and also an hour to an hour and a half after the dawn chorus has started, then the males start flying around and start to forage. So I try to time the day to start when we can get nets open, when that activity is really starting to ramp up, which for a lot of birds, they're starting to sing, but they're not as active yet.
Okay. Oh, so many questions. Okay, let me start with, you used incubating or brooding. The same, different, how?
So incubating refers to when a female is sitting on eggs, and brooding refers to when a female is sitting on young. So it's different according to the species in terms of how many days post-hatch the young are able to regulate their own body temperature. And so that period of when they can't really regulate their internal body temperature, the females will be sitting on the young and will be brooding them to keep them warm. And in some species, males and females brood, but in robins, typically, at least from what I know, and they continue to surprise me, it seems like females do the majority of the brooding.
And why are robins such early risers compared to their other songbird?
And that is such a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. I do find it really interesting. It differs too according to latitude in terms of, how early robins will start singing. Of course, as you go up in latitude, the days are longer because they have more sunlight. And so the robins progressively, as you move up, are progressively starting earlier and earlier. And before I moved to DC, I was living in Alaska, and it really did seem like the robins sang all the time. And, generally, like where I was, we didn't get a full 24 hours of daylight, but it was pretty close. And robins would be singing most of that time. And around the DC area, I'm always looking at my watch to see, okay, when's the first other species to start singing? And it's usually an hour at least before other birds start to sing in the morning. And why that is, I don't really know. Like usually there are patterns across species, like, who are the ones, the first ones to start the chorus and then so on. But what the function of why they invest so much in song, I ask friends all the time, because the other like really confusing thing about robins is that they're not really territorial. And so people always think song, like a big function of song, it's not the only function, but a big function of song is to defend space, basically to sing your heart out and say, this is mine, this is my turf, like don't go near me. And robins, in that sense at least, don't seem to use song to defend their territories. And yet they're the first ones singing in the morning and the last ones singing at night. So they put in a lot of time into song. And it's definitely something that I think about a lot.
What do they use to defend their territory?
My general sense is that, I think what's so surprising about robins is that they're this incredibly common species. And yet a lot of the things about their basic ecology, we still don't have good answers for, or answers at all. And territory size is one of them. And usually, like when you work with territorial individuals, like, kind of tried and true method for mapping out their territory is you walk around and see where their favored perches are and where they're singing from those perches. And then you basically just take GPS points at all those locations and then, get some estimate of that area. And there are definitely areas where robins will perch and sing from. My general sense is that they kind of have this like nest territory where they will do pretty intense mate defense. So the males, like when the females are starting to build their nests, this is what I've noticed, at least through observations, that the males are most aggressive during that time, in terms of they just kind of follow the female all around as she's like hopping around and getting nest material and getting mud. And the male will just like follow her around. And as she flies up from the ground to where she's selected her nest site, he'll just like, fly with her and kind of just like sit there and watch her and then fly back to the ground as she goes to get mud. And there are these like aggressive interactions that you see. You'll see two robins like fly up and they'll like flutter and, like act pretty aggressive towards each other and then like come back down to the ground. And, that seems to be some level of territory defense. And the interesting thing there too is, I always just assumed that it was always two males like coming up together to fight. And, since I've been color banding robins in the DC area, I can use the color bands to identify individuals. It's two observations, so who knows how common it is, but I've seen two robins come up and one of the robins was a female. So, females seem to be pretty defensive of their area as well. I see the kind of aggressive interactions and the mate defense that in my mind is where their territorial behavior comes from. But, song must play a role, but, what role it plays, I'm not fully sure.
Sounds like the males are a real bodyguard for the female mate. Another question that came to mind from your description of your field season is, why is the female the first to sing? The female robin, she'll come off the nest and start singing before the male does.
The female robin will come off the nest to forage, but to my knowledge, which, this could be another thing that I'm overlooking, I haven't noticed it. And because I do have color banded individuals, I do watch them quite a bit. But to my knowledge, it's not known whether females sing. So at least in robins, it's just the males that are singing.
Well, thank you for that. I feel like in that several minute bit, I've learned a lot about robins. And I was curious then, why robins? I mean, you gave part of the answer, right? That they're an understudied species. But if you could answer that more fully, like why the American robin? I
get that question asked a lot because, people are like, oh, it's just a robin, like who cares? They're super common. If people overestimate what we know about them because they're so common. But I'd say why I'm studying robins, why robins are so cool is they're kind of the perfect species to study migration. And which is, the bulk of my PhD dissertation is asking questions about, what shapes migration, what are the patterns of migration, and, how flexible is migration. And, we know a lot about migration at this point, but there's still a lot of kind of classic questions of why do birds migrate? And, why do some birds migrate and some don't? We have a lot of great hypotheses, and there's a bulk of work trying to answer those questions, but there's still no, like concrete one way or the other, or, like the jury's still out basically. And a lot of the literature and research on migration comes from studying migrants. So you're only kind of studying one part of that spectrum. And so what makes robins so cool is they have all flavors of the migration spectrum, in that you have some that are resident that don't migrate at all. And then on the other end, you have populations of robins that are completely migratory, so they all migrate. And then kind of that in between is where you get a mix, where you have, you can just randomly put your finger on a map and, put your finger on Missouri, and you might get within, say, some patch of woods that you would, call a population. You might have 60% of those robins that stay year round, and then 40% that migrate. And I think that percentage of how much they migrate is different according to latitude and, a bunch of different factors. So it's a really great species to study, the factors driving migration, because you kind of have that whole spectrum within a single species that you can make these really great comparisons across those populations, which is basically my dissertation in a nutshell, that I'm studying them at a bunch of different latitudes and in different populations to document what they do and then why and what shapes what they do.
Was the robin the only species you considered? Did you have other candidates that followed that same kind of pattern where you had year-round and then migratory?
For my dissertation, there's more than just the fact that robins are a great species to study for those reasons. Some of it was, logistical. I started my PhD at the start of the pandemic. And initially I was going to do a completely different PhD in terms of different species, different questions. And the species I was going to work on were in this really remote part of Alaska, and, which you could only access by plane or by boat. And of course, with everything that shut down and access being super limited, that kind of just got thrown by the wayside. And then this opportunity, and I'd already started working on robins before I started my PhD. It wasn't as comprehensive as it is in the form that it is now. And kind of the opportunity to work on robins popped up. And then I was like, well, robins are literally everywhere. I could study them just from my backyard. And so this whole problem of access and like traveling to go to study sites was not a concern at all when it came to robins. In a lot of ways, what shaped why I ended up working with them. But in terms of, are there other species that are similar to robins in this respect of showing a suite of different migratory behaviors? There definitely are. And I think in North America, another really great species to study that would be dark-eyed juncos. I definitely wonder about some other species that we don't really know, but are probably overlooked in terms of people just assuming that they're fully migratory, but maybe not. And I'd guess there might be a mix with yellow-rumped warblers, just thinking about songbirds, but for sure there's, lots of raptors that show a mix, and bigger birds, water birds show a mix of strategies. It's actually, that's another kind of rallying cry of my research and people who study this stuff is that a lot of the research has been very biased towards, kind of the charismatic migrants that migrate these amazing distances. And it's just like mind blowing when you think about what they're capable of. And yet, like, probably what is more common and more prevalent across not just birds, but across animals is doing more of this mix of some that are migratory, some that are not. And so that's probably more common, and definitely people need to research it more.
I hope this is not a spoiler alert for people who will read your dissertation. At this point in your research, if you had to create a listicle of like a robin facts, what are some amazing things about robins that you haven't yet shared that you would want people to know about?
Well, I definitely, when I try to get people jazzed about robins, and this part is published. So we have published one paper so far that's kind of just like a teaser of like, hey, robins do different things across their range. And I always tell people about Alaska robins and the Alaska birds that we studied. We tagged them initially in Denali National Park. And they wintered in places like Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas. And if you do measure those distances, they're on par, if not longer distances than a lot of, the sweetheart migrants that people love, like, black-throated blue warblers and American redstarts and all these really colorful warblers that people love. And we think of as these kind of classic neotropical, temperate, long-distance migrants. And so that's always something I tell people, that Alaska robins are way cooler than these long-distance, colorful warblers.
Could start a fight on Twitter with those words.
Yeah, I definitely like to point it out to my advisor, Pete Mara, who has devoted most of his career to studying American redstarts. And one day I just looked up, and redstarts too, like, because they're so small, they can't really wear the tracking technology that bigger birds can wear. So there's a general, sense of their migration distances based on geolocator tags, but it's not as precise compared to the GPS tags that I've been using on robins. So it's kind of like, a guesstimate. But yeah, in my first semester, I just measured some distances of like breeding locations of redstarts and wintering locations and compared it with the Alaska robins. I was like, oh, Alaska robins migrate further. I definitely have to razz Pete about this.
I mean, that could break the internet.
At least bird Twitter, maybe.
Yeah. That would definitely get that hashtag trending. Have you always been passionate about birds?
I have not always been passionate about birds. So I definitely get this a lot where, you give the spiel of what you do for a career and what you study. And a lot of people just assume if you're an ornithologist, you were that little kid that watched birds and loved birds. And so you grew up with this love of birds. And I definitely say that I was a late bloomer to birds. I definitely loved being outside and was really into nature, but I didn't come from an outdoorsy family. I'd never been camping with my family before. And I just kind of had more of an appreciation, but more from like a removed sense, I guess. And I grew up in Florida where wading birds are super common. And so at some level, I knew some of the common species that I would see as a kid and generally just loved animals. So I would say that I was just kind of a general nature and animal lover. And always had an interest in biology and science. And, I still joke that I want to be a marine biologist when I grow up, because to this day, my most favorite animals have always been marine associated animals. But yeah, I took an ornithology class in college in the last semester of my last year. So I took it late, but I had a really great prof, and it really, I wouldn't say that I necessarily have a spark bird, but I kind of had a spark moment where in that class we were learning about migration. And at that time, it was, I think it was like 2009 or 2010, which at that point, these geolocator tags, had, very in their infancy been starting to be used on songbirds. And I remember we learned about, a couple of studies where they used these tags and learned that, these songbirds migrated distances we didn't think fathomable. And I remember I just had this moment where I was like, this is so cool. And just thinking about how cool birds were and the age old question of why go so far, to meet your needs, just why go so far when you could, potentially go to a place 100 miles away and it's just as good. And I think it was in that moment that I thought to myself, I want to study birds. And I found them, from a science perspective, super interesting. So I guess that was, I don't know, when I was 22, maybe. And then I didn't really become a birder until years later when, after I had the ornithology class, I started doing a lot of seasonal field positions that were bird focused and, started doing birding kind of slowly at first. And then didn't really consider myself a birder until I started doing eBird. And my eBird start was in 2013. So I think it was like 25 at that point. So yeah, not really a spark bird, but yeah, definitely a moment where I was like, this is so cool. And I could see myself having a career in this.
What was it about eBird that made you a birder, or which came first, I suppose? You had a very interesting way of framing that transition. So
I'm definitely in the camp of what makes you a birder is if you go outside and you enjoy birds. But in terms of, I didn't consider myself a birder because at the time I associated being a birder with like, oh, you must have lists and you must keep track. And before that, I never really kept track. I was like, yeah, I've seen that bird before, like I've seen that species before. But yeah, I felt like I wasn't official. And I think that was, shaped by the culture of birding that I didn't really think of myself as a birder unless I started keeping lists. And I definitely have kind of a life list that, I keep track, but most of it's not on eBird. And I'm still pretty terrible about eBirding, but I try.
what's your favorite bird on your life list?
Man, that's tough. I mean, I have a favorite bird that is fairly common, which I guess is kind of on brand for me. And that's the common loon. And I just absolutely love them. I love them so much because I associate them with a lot of really good memories and kind of I attach them to my beginnings in wildlife biology and just like changing my life in a lot of ways because I, in addition to being a late bloomer to birds, I was late bloomer to biology. So I have an English degree and I almost graduated with an English degree. And in my junior year, did an internship in Alaska and discovered that wildlife biology was a thing. And after that, like I came back and I was like, oh, like I'm going to start taking some classes and test this out and see what I think of it. And then from there, I just like stayed in college longer so that I could get a wildlife biology degree to pursue it more seriously. Yeah, like in addition to just kind of changing my career trajectory, like I said, I didn't really grow up in an outdoorsy family. So that experience in Alaska, I had my first camping experience, had my first backpacking experience, just all these like really amazing outdoor experiences that really also changed. Like I do all those things now as an adult that, I didn't do before. And I really love those things. And loon, why they're connected to all of this is in my first couple of weeks in Alaska, I had to do but I had a canoe trip that I went on as part of my training for this environmental education job that I had. And, every morning we'd wake up to the sound of loons calling. And that canoe trip was at the time, in some ways, super hellish for me because it was a 3-day canoe trip. So it was, overnight you'd find some place off of a lake to go camp. And it rained the whole time. And it was part of our initiation. We had to portage our canoes across different lakes. It was part of the process that we were responsible for carrying our own canoe. And they're 50, 60 pounds. Because it was super rainy, it was so muddy. And I was slipping with this big canoe over my head. And it was just what am I doing? And, for context, I showed up to Alaska and I didn't know what an Nalgene was. I didn't have a day pack. I didn't have all these things that are kind of standard fare for doing outdoor experiences. So I had to learn all of that because I didn't have any exposure to it growing up. But it ended up obviously being an amazing experience, even despite the mosquitoes and the rain and the mud, and stands out as a super formative time for me. Bundle up all of those good feelings with loons, and they're my favorite bird. And I still put them above all of these ridiculously colorful and beautiful birds that I've seen in different countries and in different areas.
Just listening to that story, I mean, you stuck out that really challenging experience. It's really opened up your professional life. Are you able to replicate the loon's call?
Maybe at one time, but I would be way too embarrassed to try it now. But yeah, one thing I didn't mention that also is kind of tied with that is, I had this canoe trip, but then later in the summer, the internship that I was working was more environmental education. I worked the visitor center and I also did these kind of guided wildflower walks, and I gave public programs on salmon and the wildlife in the area. But this is at a time I was kind of at a crossroads of what do I do with this English degree? What do I do with my life? And then I got exposed to this experience, but always had in the back of my head, I really like animals and biology, and where does this all fit? And so while I was doing this internship on my days off, I would join the biologists on staff and help them with their stuff. So I got to help with snowshoe hare surveys, and I did some vegetation mapping and stuff like that. And then later in the summer, there were these visiting researchers who were doing common loon captures. And my boss had emailed, the whole refuge staff, these researchers are here, and if you'd like to join, let me know. And of course, I signed up for every day. And so I got to help out with this team that was capturing loons. And, at that point, I was super green. I had no experience. So I just basically got told to hold the bird while they did everything in terms of measuring it and banding it and all that stuff. And so I got to hold one, which was really amazing. And they're way bigger than you think they are. So yeah, I have this really cute picture of me when I was 20 with a loon, and I'm generally a small person. So this bird just looks really huge in my lap, and I have my little fish and wildlife volunteer jacket on. And so that too, I had this really cool experience, and it was this super hands-on experience with a bird that, really changed my world.
Well, it feels like the common loon is a spark bird. You want to give a shout out to that internship?
I 100% will be happy to talk about it. I talk about the organization to everybody I know because it was so life-changing for me to have this experience. So I worked with Fish and Wildlife Service, but I did the internship through the SCA, the Student Conservation Association, which they still exist. And I think their 50-year anniversary a while ago. So they've been running for a long time. And you talk with federal biologists, and often they will say, I got my start through SCA. So SCA is really great. That said, like, it's not a paid thing. So they would cover your housing, they'd cover your travel to the location, and then they also gave you a stipend that would cover like food and other essentials. And I was in a position where I was like, I can't take something that doesn't cover, like, I can't like go into debt to have this experience, basically. So basically the SCA liaises with different federal entities. So like, it's not just Fish and Wildlife. So they also work with Forest Service, BLM, a lot of different entities. And then it's like kind of across the map in terms of what you do. Like, if you're interested in biology, there's any sorts of things, like there's birds, there's mammals. If you're interested in plants, there's like botany and more plant focused internships. If you're interested in like cultural anthropology or like library science or archives, there's those type of internships. Like, you're interested in archaeology, fossils, that side of things. Like, there's those. I mean, it kind of covers like what, like you think of all the different positions that you might find in federal service that have some sort of natural resource component. They kind of cover the gamut of those positions. So it's a really great program. And it may be that they offer more financially now with, things changing for the better with those things. But at the time that I did it, that's what they covered.
That's really good to know. And I think you phrased it quite elegantly, not wanting to go into debt to have this really formative experience. I'll definitely put that information in the show link. That's really wonderful. SCA. Before we close, I wanted to ask, what are your hopes, your goals for the rest of your field season? Because you've got a couple more weeks.
I'm definitely down to the wire at this point in terms of, the robins, birds in general. Like, this time of year, things have really slowed down. Birds aren't singing like they used to, and breeding has really started to, it's either done or it's slowing down as well. But I have a handful of these GPS tags left that I'd really like to get them out on birds. And I still have to go to Georgia to try to recover some tags from birds that I captured down there as well. So Georgia is another site. So I haven't gone down there yet this summer, and I'm hoping to, set up nets over several days to try to capture birds there. And then, I still have a handful of tags left in the DC area that I'm hoping to get out on DC robins. So a couple of weeks left, but the big final push to try to get all my tags out, and any other tags, tags that were put on birds last year, try to get those tags recovered from birds.
And where can we keep track of you and your robin work?
I definitely need to be a lot better about updating my website, but I do have a website, and I think it's just my name. I think it's emilyjwilliams.weebly.com. I'm pretty terrible at updating it. So I'd say that Twitter is probably the best way to just know, oh, caught a bird, or just got this bird back, and look at this cool map of what it just did. So I generally am pretty active on Twitter, and my handle is Wayfaring Willie. Otherwise, there's a couple of, they've already been published, but there's been a few popular articles just kind of highlighting some of the stuff that we're learning and what we're doing with this project. There's an Audubon article and an Associated Press article that went out last year, just kind of more of a teaser, of what are we doing and why it's important that people can find if they just Google American robins and migration, something like that, and those things will pop up.
Well, I mean, I really do like the American redstart, but few autumns ago, I was in my patch and the sky just filled with migrating robins, and I was spellbound. So I think that, I've been kind of Team Robin ever since. So I've very much enjoyed this conversation.
Makes my heart happy to hear that. And Yeah, a friend of mine just said the other day, get you someone that loves you like Emily loves robins, which I thought was hilarious. But yeah, I mean, it's not just robins. I'm always gonna be a defender of underappreciated things. So I'm super happy that you enjoy robins. And yeah, the migration aspect in terms of, or just seeing their flocks, that was another, like, kind of really cool factoid about robins, is that they will form these massive roosts. And sometimes, like, there will be these roosts that I've read about them in, like, the Midwest, the lower Midwest, like in Missouri and Arkansas, where there'll be like 200,000 robins. I want to see that. Like, I've never seen that. I want to go to these places just to be able to see something like that. I've seen roosts that are like maybe up to 1,000, which also is mind blowing. But to see something like that, I think it would be incredible. So yeah, they're super cool, and I'm glad that you think so too.
Yeah. Really, Emily, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking some time out of a pretty full day in a really fuller, like, feel season. So thank you.
It was really fun. It was great chatting. This is Emily Williams, and today I am out at Meadowlark Botanical Gardens in Fairfax County, Virginia. And this morning we're here to catch American robins. So far we've caught 4 this morning. It's almost 11 o'clock a.m. right now, and we've been out here since 4 a.m. and we caught most of our birds before 8 o'clock this morning.